Washington, D.C. has a unique look. Unlike other major U.S. cities, it doesn't have any skyscrapers. You might have heard that no building can be taller than the dome of the Capitol, or that buildings must be lower than the height of the Washington Monument. But in reality, maintaining a stocky skyline has been on the minds of architects and city planners since D.C.'s origin. And politicians have been fighting over whether or not to keep it that way since. So what's with Washington's skyscraper squabbles, and why might D.C. finally be considering raising the roof? When the Capitol was established in 1790, the design of Washington, D.C. was largely shaped by the ideas of two men, Pierre-Charles L'Enfant and Thomas Jefferson. Both were keen on French architecture and essentially designed the city from the ground up on a large piece of land along the Potomac River. City planner L'Enfant envisioned wider avenues, a national mall, and exclusive landmarks akin to the layout of Versailles. He wanted buildings constructed in crucial locations based on the elevation and shapes of waterways. The plan was devised on the idea of equality, as his idea for a national mall would be open to everyone. So while the plan was inspired by European models, it was designed using American ideals. Thomas Jefferson pictured buildings that were low and convenient, similar to Paris. He didn't want it to be based on a French monarchy like the Palace of Versailles symbolized. Instead, he submitted a plan for a more modest federal town than L'Enfant's ambitious design. While the plan went in the direction of L'Enfant's vision, Jefferson's idea for a horizontal skyline was still influential in the final construction. In 1791, George Washington enacted the first building height restriction in order to provide for the extinguishment of fires and the openness and convenience of the town, even though he worried that it might diminish the importance of the capital city. The heights of American cities remained relatively uniform throughout much of the 1800s. Yet, towards the end of the century, cities like Chicago, New York, and Boston began loosening restrictions and embracing technologies that allowed for a new type of building to emerge, the skyscraper. But D.C. did not take part in this initial building boom. Then, in 1894, one architect named Thomas Franklin Schneider challenged these traditions when he designed a 14-story building. When the Cairo apartment building was constructed, it towered over the surrounding 3-story row houses. Fewer than 240,000 people lived in the district at the time, and most homes consisted of larger families, which meant fewer residential properties were needed. Residents worried about the Cairo's structural safety and whether firefighters would be able to get equipment to upper floors in case of an emergency. In response to the concerns around the Cairo's height, D.C. passed the Height of Buildings Act in 1899. Originally, the law did in fact reference the Capitol building, which was 288 feet. It stated that no other building could be taller than its height. So why isn't Washington, D.C. filled with 28-story buildings today? That's because the law was amended in 1910 to restrict heights even more. Now, no building could be more than 20 feet taller than the width of the street in front of it. This maximized buildings to a height of 130 feet or 13 stories. The only exception was for buildings on Pennsylvania Avenue, where an extreme height of 160 feet was permitted. Structures such as domes, chimneys, and penthouses over elevator shafts could also be higher, but only subject to mayor approval. This 1910 amendment to the Height of Buildings Act is still in effect to this day, with only a couple minor exceptions. This includes the commercial building 1 Franklin Square, standing at 210 feet, and the old post office at 315 feet, but it was built before the limits were set. Yet D.C. is the only city in the U.S. that still has a federal law regarding building height restrictions. It can only be changed by an act of Congress and not by D.C. itself. So while the law's original wording could explain why many believe the city's buildings are restricted based on the Capitol's height, that was only true for 11 years, and it hasn't been the case for over a century. But now, the population has swelled to over 702,000 people, and many young professionals live downtown as opposed to large families. These changes have called the Height of Buildings Act into question. Several businesses have been forced out of the downtown area, and residential developments are dispersed, and you'll notice the surrounding cities like Arlington are growing upwards. Over the years, the law has been heavily debated among officials and residents. D.C. Council Chair Phil Mendelson argues, "Our skyline is a defining characteristic of our city. We are different from any other city in the country." Aaron Landry, an advisory neighborhood commissioner, states that there are tools the city could utilize to maintain the historic character. "We have historic districts, we have zoning. Removing the height limit would enable places that would be more acceptant of having taller buildings." Many opponents believe the restrictions are driving up rent and housing prices. David Schleicher, a professor of law at Yale University, says, "I think that strategically increasing the height along commercial corridors will make more people happy with their housing units. It would make office space cheaper, and the cost would be relatively limited or zero." Martin Moeller, head curator of the National Building Museum, disagrees. "New York City and London have tremendous affordability problems, and there are plenty of skyscrapers being built there." Due to its controversy, the Height of Buildings Act has faced proposals for change. In 2014, the mayor of D.C. amended the law slightly to allow for mechanical penthouses to be turned into habitable spaces. Mechanical penthouses are the areas on rooftops that contain structures such as heating ducts or elevator shafts. With the new change, these areas were now allowed to become additional offices, restaurants, or apartments, but only if it was 1 story or less. This didn't change the actual height of any building, though. Instead, it just allowed for these industrial rooftop spaces to be more architecturally pleasing. The act is currently in the middle of another potential change. In 2019, D.C.'s Mayor Muriel Bowser made a proposal to expand affordable housing in the district. She wanted 36,000 new housing units by 2025, but noted that the current tools and laws didn't make this idea realistic. And a recent revision of the city's comprehensive plan does leave some room for potentially increasing the height limit. So while this revision might open up a reevaluation of the Height Act for the mayor's vision, Congress would still have to pass the legislation because it is a federal law. But for now, Washington, D.C. will continue to remain a skyscraperless city for the foreseeable future.